Okay, today I'm going to show you how I made my A-line dress just using the bodice pieces from my round neck dress as slopers. So you need the back and the front for your 18-inch round neck dress. I folded the front down the centre front line and traced around it, ready to do the A-line section on the side seam only. So the centre front I'm going to extend down with my ruler, and then I'm going to measure some hips and hemline and get that drawn onto the paper as well. So I'm going to take some measurements of my doll, which is about 5.5 inches in the underarm part, and when I measured my dress front, that is about 5 3/4 inches, so there's a little bit of ease in the dress pattern. So now I'm going to measure across her hips, and just from this you can see that her hips are a little bit wider than the underarms, so you do need the A-line to come down. You can't just do it straight down. So if we measure approximately across here, let's get her arm out of the way. That is a good 6 inches. So I'm going to go from 5.5 to 6 inches across her hips, but you still need some ease, so you probably want the front section to be a total of 6.5 inches, plus you need seam allowance, so it will probably be 7 inches across. You can't forget ease and seam allowance when you're drafting things. So now I've got the width and I need the length down from the neck where the widest part of the hips is, so that's about 5.5 inches. So from the centre front I'm going to measure down 5.5 inches and half of 7, which is 3.5 across, and then I'll be able to draw the A-line on the side seam. Okay, so now I've extended the centre front line and I've measured down 5.5 inches and ruled a horizontal line across, put the little dot, and then I've put my ruler on the underarm and the dot and created the A-line side seam. Now I'm probably not teaching this in a purist way because I like to add my seam allowances when I draft my patterns. I think I don't know about correct, but I think the usual way is to do things actual measurements and then add the seam allowance after. But I just find this much easier. I know that it's going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance when I've drawn it up. So now I'm going to work out the hem length. So I've started right at the top of the neck, so that includes the neck seam allowance. And you want it to a sort of a cute length, so you might want the finished length at about 8.5 in the front. Then you have to allow a 1/4 inch for turning the hem. And because you have to fold the fabric at the neck with the facing and at the hem to turn up the hem, it's a good idea to allow an extra 1/8 of an inch to account for the folding. Otherwise your dress might look just a little bit too short. So I want 8.5 plus a 1/4 inch seam allowance, hem allowance, plus another 1/8 of an inch. So 8 7/8 is going to be the length from down the centre front. Okay, so I've measured down the centre front to 8 7/8, but you have to remember for an A-line, to make it sort of sit nicely, the hemline has to be curved slightly. So if you want it to not be any longer in the centre front, you've got to make it a little bit shorter on the side. So I'm going to make a mark a 1/4 inch above my horizontal line on the side seam and just sketch in a shallow curve for the hemline. So here I've drawn in my shallow curve for the hemline. It's the right length in the centre front and comes up just as fraction on the side seam. Now you can add in your seam allowances and you're ready to go for the front. See that little mark just here? I made a note of where the high waistline came, so that if I want to add decoration down the front, it's a good place to stop the ruffle around the front like I had for my red dress. It's just a neat place for stopping, so I thought I'd mark that on the pattern as well. So because my dress has a back facing and does up at the back, I'm using the Aline Dress back because it has the 1/2 inch facing. So I'm going to trace around this one, but to make it so the centre back and the centre front are on the same side, it's just easier later when you're trying to match up the side seams. I'm going to turn my back over so my centre back is on the right hand side and my centre front piece is on the right hand side as well. So that way I can match up the underarms and make sure the hem is the right length after I've finished both pieces. So first of all, I'm going to trace around my back piece and I'm going to mark in the centre back and the facing fold line, and I'm going to also mark where the high waist is, just in case I want to use the pattern for something else later. So now I've traced my pattern piece. I've marked on the centre back line and the facing fold line, and at the top where you're going to have the lined section, it will be the stitching line for the lining. So now I need to measure the hips across the doll's bottom. To make sure I'm getting the hip line in the same area for the front and the back, I'm going to line up my front level with the armhole and then straight parallel to the centre back, and then put a little mark where the front hip line is. So I've marked in here. So now I know where to measure for the hips for the doll's back. So when I measured across the doll's bottom from hip to hip, I got 6.5 inches. It's a little bit more than across the front. I'm going to add a 1/2 inch ease and a 1/2 inch for the seams like I did with the front, and then divide by 2 and I get 3 3/4 inches. So where the front was only 3.5 inches from centre front to the side seam, the back will be 3 3/4 inches from the centre back to the side seam, because it has to go around her bottom as well. So I'm going to measure that line across and draw in my angled side seam. So I've measured in a horizontal line across to the side seam edge 3 3/4 inches, and then made a dot, and then I've just put my ruler on to match the armhole with the dot and drawn down to the bottom of the page. So in order to get the hemline right and the side seams the same length, I'm going to put the front on top of the back, match it up at the armholes and along the side seam, and put a mark where the hems match up. And then I need to just pivot it slightly so that I'm going to pivot at this point up here and make it so that the centre back and the centre front are parallel and the hip line matches up. I'm only going to turn it just a fraction. So now the back hip line matches up and the back and front, centre front and centre back are parallel, and I'm going to put a mark where the hemline comes there. So that means that the centre back and centre front will be the same length, and the side seams will be the same length, and you have this little curve here. So I've just made the shallow curve for the hem, joining up the 2 points. I ruled a straight line across the facing fold line and a little bit straight to about here, and then work the curve from there. That way when I fold the back facing over, it won't sort of stick out underneath the curved section. So I've drawn in the 1/4 inch hem and the seam allowances, and now I'm ready to work out the lining for the top section. You're just going to trace over the front and the back and bring it down as far as you want and curve it up, make it shaped if you like. I'll show you how to do that now. So I've just traced the top of the front and the top of the back onto a new sheet, and now I'm going to work out where the facing line will go. So on the side seams, I've realised I need a 1/4 inch for the seam, and I've allowed the facing to extend down 1/2 inch. Now I'm not going to turn any hems on the facing, I'm just going to overlock it. So that means the facing will be 1/2 inch long. So I've done that for the back and the front. And then I'm going to curve it up slightly. So I've made the front, instead of going straight across, it's 1 3/4 inches down from the top of the front, centre front, and a little bit lower in the back, so it's 2 inches down from the top of the back. Now if you're making dresses for smaller dolls, these measurements are going to be different, but the scaling is going to sort of look much the same. Now what I've noticed when you're making curves, you need to start off with a little section of straight line first. So that way they match up neatly at the side seams and the centre front doesn't have a funny point in it. So I've measured in 1/2 inch from the sides, so that's 1/4 inch for the side seam and a 1/4 inch straight line to start my curve. And from the back I've measured in 1/2 inch, so that's where the seam line will be, and another 1/4 inch of straight line. In the centre front I've done just a 1/4 inch in from the centre front, and that will take away a funny pointy look at the centre of the facing. So now I've just started at the end of my little straight sections and done a smooth curve to delineate the bottom of the facing lining. So I'm going to put in my seam allowances and centre backs and things like that, and then I'm going to cut them out. So here are all my pieces for the Aline dress. For the foundation members, I gave them my original Aline dress pattern, and it's a little bit wider than this at the hips, so it sort of looks really A-line and a little bit loose. So this one's a little bit tighter around the hips. So I think it will be perfect for those 60s designs that have the rectangles delineated with big wide black lines and white and one with a bit of a colour in it, because they look almost straight, but you do need this slight A-line effect, otherwise it doesn't fit over the hips at all. So here you go, there's your A-line pattern, and you can use the same method for whatever size doll you've got. You need to start with the neckline and the armhole. If you've got a pattern that has a suitable neckline and the regular armhole, you can easily make your own A-line dress.